This is a conversation I've been really excited to have my whole life, being a mixed race person who does identify as African American, but nonetheless, I am a mixed race individual. So for me, the problem of racial categories has been ongoing and ever present. And so despite decades of scientific evidence that overwhelmingly supports ending racial categories, most major US funded institutions, hospitals, and systems still collect self-reported race and ethnicity data. These data are used in a multitude of ways, some of which include outdated and dangerous applications to the delivery of healthcare, social services, and resource allocation. So in order to ensure the appropriate use of race, ethnicity, and ancestry in science, healthcare, and society, we need to question the fundamental assumptions that dictate these practices. Our panel of experts is seeking to end the ways race and ethnicity are misused in society and create an inclusive global framework for studying and describing human populations that acknowledges and accounts for the rich spectrum of diversity across the globe. The purpose of this panel discussion is to include community stakeholders in the process of developing a better way forward, elevating diverse voices and perspectives on current uses and practices of categorizing people into racial and ethnic boxes in which we do not naturally exist. So with that, I'm going to briefly give you, some background on our speakers because, as I said, they're phenomenal, and I just want to take time to remind you of that. So first, Dr. Evelynn Hammonds is currently the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science and Professor of African American Studies at Harvard University and former Dean of Harvard College. Marian Wright Edelman, the founder of the Children's Defense Fund, had written an announcement in her blog in 2008 calling out the appointment of Dr. Evelynn Hammonds as the first African-American woman to be appointed Dean of Harvard College. She holds degrees in physics and electrical engineering from Spelman and Georgia Tech, as well as a master's in physics from MIT, where she became the founder of MIT's Center for the Study of Diversity in Science, Technology, and Medicine. She earned her PhD in the history of science from Harvard, and as you can see, she's quite well published, but I did want to share at least one of those books that's relevant today, The Nature of Difference, Sciences of Race in the United States, from Jefferson to Genomics. Thank you, Dr. Hammonds, for being with us today. And I'm just gonna go ahead and give an overview of our other speakers, but Dr. Hammonds will be our first speaker today. Next, you'll be hearing from Dr. David Hayes Bautista, who is a distinguished professor of medicine and director of the Center for the Study of Latino Health and Culture at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA in the Division of General Internal Medicine. He graduated from UC Berkeley and completed his doctoral work in basic sciences at the University of California Medical Center at San Francisco. He served on the faculty at the School of Public Health at UC Berkeley until 1987, when he took his current position at UCLA. His research on the Latino epidemiological paradox led him to research links between culture, behavior, and health, and his articles appear in journals ranging from academic medicine to Salud Pública de Mexico. Since 2007, his research has expanded to include the emergence of Latino civil society in California during the Spanish, colonial, Mexican Republic, and US statehood periods. And hence the book that you see in front of you, one of his most recent publications. Hopefully you'll take time to peruse that, as well as his other articles and books. Next, Dr. Alice Popejoy is a public health geneticist and computational biologist. And if you haven't already, you might need to get your dictionaries out because there are a lot of things that I have to look up when I'm having conversations with these fantastic people. So don't be scared. We can't see you. Feel free to get the thesaurus, pull up your Google dictionary while they're talking, because, all of us are going to have to keep pace with these great minds. So again, Dr. Alice Popejoy also has a background in statistical genetics and studies the ethical, legal, social implications of genomics research. Alice received her PhD in public health genetics and certificate in statistical genetics from the University of Washington. She's working on comparative evolutionary genomics as a fellow and as a postdoctoral scholar at Bustamante Lab, where she leads the Ancestry and Diversity Working Group of the Clinical Genome Resource Consortium. And you can find this particular talk that she gave on YouTube, Genetic Ancestry Testing. And lastly, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Yudell, who you can blame for this entire panel because he and I started this conversation and it took us down this path. So everything that goes wrong today, you can call him, and whatever goes right, feel free to shoot me a message. So Dr. Michael Yudell is a public health historian and ethicist. He completed his PhD and his MPH in socio-medical sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Yudell is the author of several books, including most recently Race Unmasked, which I read very fervently over the holidays. It's fantastic. Biology and Race in the 20th Century, winner of the 2016 Arthur Viseltier Award from the American Public Health Association. Along with Dr. Samuel K. Roberts, Yudell edits the Columbia University Press series, Race, Inequality, and Health. He also conducts research on autism and ethics. That's not one word, on autism and ethics, including currently a National Science Foundation project examining the ethics of community-engaged autism research. Yudell is writing A Way of Being Human, A History of Autism Spectrum Disorders, from Columbia University Press, forthcoming. Finally, Yudell is chair of the Pennsylvania Secretary of Health's Newborn Screening and Follow-Up Technical Advisory Board. On a lighter note, Yudell performs monthly at the Philadelphia Improv Theater in the long-running show Study Hall. That means he promises to be funny during his presentation, and we will hold him accountable to that. All right, and with that, enough of me. We are going to turn this show over to Dr. Evelynn Hammonds. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so Mackenzie can bring her presentation up.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm really happy to be here for this conversation this afternoon, and I hope we get some good questions about a very sort of fraught issue, as Michelle noted in her opening comments. Can I have the next slide, please? So what's the issue? And in one way we can talk about this issue is the question has been posed as, is race a useful category for analyzing and understanding biological, genetic, disease differences between human groups and individuals? Or, as some people put it, is race a biological or a social category? And the answer you get depends on whom you ask. And that has been the answer for a very, very, very long time. Next slide. One point we can look at, and I think I use this example because to me it shows just how complicated it has been for people to come to terms with issues of race. So there was a conference in 2004, seems like quite a while ago now, but I assure you the issues are still relevant, where it was entitled Taking Off the Color Blinders, Geneticists and Historians Grapple with the Gray Areas of Race. Next slide. And 100 social scientists and geneticists gathered in Alexandria, Virginia to sort out the meaning of race, but didn't quite. Next slide. They tackled every thorny question from their different academic disciplines. The historians had to listen to panels about clusters of genetic alleles, and the geneticists had to hear about race as a power relationship. They talked about race and geographic variation. They pondered replacing the word race with ethnic group. Next slide. It talked about racism, multiculturalism, college diversity goals, racial self-identification in the US Census, microethnic groups, the racialization of Mexican Americans, and how come no one ever asked why all the white kids sit together in the cafeteria. Next slide. When Leif Mullings, an anthropologist from City University, sardonically said, only people of color have race and only women have gender, everyone knew what she meant. Their positions were not necessarily inconsistent, but it requires a little bit of explaining, and that's part of what was happening in the meeting. Race is complicated. Nothing about the discussion is, pardon the pun, black and white. Next. It doesn't exist biologically, but it does exist socially. At the time, Alan Goodman was the president of the American Anthropological Association, which was one of the sponsors of this interdisciplinary meeting. If there was a consensus that emerged from 2 days of conversation, it was the notion that race is some kind of social cultural construct. And investigations into the human genome had, up to that point, failed to turn up any evidence that there's such a thing as a Caucasian, for example. Human beings are genetically rather homogeneous compared with other animals. And if you recall, could we go back to that's okay. So if you look at on that slide, you see a copy of you see a photo of the when the structure of the human genome was announced, this sort of family tree kind of in a sort of DNA kind of ladder up on, and that image became something that was widely sort of used to talk about what the genome and what human diversity was supposed to be. So this is a really interesting representation. Next slide. But the lack of biological support for traditional racial categories does not change the fact for many of the social scientists in the room that race is a kind of lived reality. And they were talking about building a public education project, which was created after this meeting, to look at the paradox of race or no race, in the words of the anthropologist Michaela Di Leonardo. There was one geneticist on hand who wasn't quite ready to do away with race entirely. He believed that race was biologically meaningful. He talked about clusters of genetic markers that correspond to geographic origin or ancestry, and he felt that these clusters were correlated with some traditional concepts of race. Though he said there's little to support the notion that some people are simply Black or simply white, as Michelle also noted in her opening remarks. The evolutionary geneticist at the meeting, Joseph Graves, said scientists have misunderstood the nature of human genetic variation. It doesn't translate into racial categories. There are no races in anatomically modern humans. A political scientist at the meeting said, people are just paying too much attention to a few morphological differences among humans. We're talking about fetishizing the shape of eyes, the shape of the nose, the color of the skin, and the texture of the hair, he said. This was all very stimulating. It was intellectually enriching. The conversations were quite engaging. And at the end of the second day, the writer of this article said the earth didn't seem as flat, but no one would go so far as call the meeting clarifying. There was also a geneticist there, Neil Rist, who also spoke a couple of years later. But I just want to make a point about this meeting. So the meeting was 2.5 days, I think. Lots of conversation. What kind of public education project was needed? It was difficult for all these scientists and social scientists to think about a public education project when they couldn't agree on the terms, the categories, the assumptions and presumptions that everyone was working under, even in the room. So how would they know what to put in an exhibit that would travel around the country for all Americans to learn more about the meanings of race? So Neil Risch, who was a very prominent geneticist, also spoke about what had happened in the meeting. And he talked about the fact that it's well known that the disease does not affect the population equally, assessing the variation in rates of disease, according to demographic factors such as sex and race or ethnicity, is really the basis of epidemiological research. And it's very important in clinical and public health practice, he noted. Next slide. The concept of race, though, he noted, triggered the greatest controversy since it had been used historically to provide support for the mistreatment of one group by another. I wouldn't use the term mistreatment, but we can talk about that later. Next slide. Also, he noted that the assignment of persons of mixed ancestry to one group, i.e. the one drop rule, which is something that is very prevalent and widely used in the US, is something that, where we talk about the fact that a single drop of Black blood is sufficient to assure membership in the Black race, instead of understanding or recognizing that mixed ancestry undermines any kind of simple formulation of the concept of race and the determination of racial categories. At the same time, Risch noted that there were numerous genetic studies of populations which identified genetic differences among people from different continents that often coincided with racial definitions, although within a different population, there's a great deal of genetic variation. And he concluded by saying recent studies at that point had demonstrated that categories created from random genetic markers correlated very strongly with those based on ancestral continent of origin or within the United States with self-identified racial and ethnic groups. But in order to really understand what was a complicated conversation now almost 20 years ago, and I will say that that conversation has emerged over and over and over again in various forums, and many of the strands that I was trying to pull out in just these few quick slides still exist, but you can't really get at why this discussion remains so fraught if you don't think about history. So asking about race or color is a very old American tradition. Next slide. Nearly every census, as you know, the US takes a census every decade. It's required by the Constitution, but every census since 1790 has measured race differently. For most of the 19th century, slaves were marked as B for Black or M for mulatto. In the 1850s, it was subdivided into white, Black, or mulatto for free inhabitants. 20 years later, the word race was used for the first time, the racial categories being white, colored, Chinese, and Indian, for example. By 1890, the mulatto category was expanded to include gradations of racial difference, including octoroon and quadroons, which lasted until the 1920s. And as you can see, this is what one of the census card looks like in the 1850s for Baltimore, Maryland. Next slide. The categories changed over the decades. The current ones that we use, white, Black, or Negro, or African American, Asian or Pacific Islander, American Indian, as well as other race, Spanish, Hispanic origin, were first put into the census in 1980. We don't use Negro anymore. But it's also important to remember that until the 1960s, all Latin Americans were categorized as white, and the shifting notion of what constitutes the Hispanic category is also something that we could talk about later. There was a Caucasian category, which was, Caucasian comes from its usage by Blumenbach in 1776, which he derived from Europeans who he believed originated in the Caucasus Mountain region, where he had the most beautiful skulls in his collection of human skulls. And now, Black refers to any person having origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa. White refers to a person having origins from any of the original peoples of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, or the Indian subcontinent. Next slide. And so if you think about the changing notions that go from 1790s into the 21st century, because we'll be having a new census soon, it's hard to argue that race is not a concept that is produced by socio-political factors, as well as people's attempt to draw correlations to human biology. I like this point by George Stocking Jr., who's a historian of anthropology, who noted even by 1900, there was no generally accepted answer to the question, what is race? The term was a catch-all. It was applied to various human groups and nations, continental regions, language groups, perceived body traits, or peoples whose similar appearance, manner, and speech persisted over time. But it was also self-evident that these were hereditary characteristics. Next slide. But lacking any theory of genetic inheritance, in the sense, race was thought of as some kind of accumulated cultural difference that was somehow carried in people's blood. And if you think about that, it speaks to a melding of social ideas and biological ideas as well. The other point that's important to make, as John Haller did as long ago as 1980, is that medical people, physicians, had a very prominent role in our understanding of racial categories. And they were some of the most significant practitioners who biologized racial categories. Physicians did that by comparing diseases between whites and African Americans. Early on, that would be between whites and Negroes, and simply assumed that there were innate biological, mental, physiological causes underlining any difference that they observed. And the only cause of these differences was something that was racial, and there was no need for any further explanation. The point about this slide that's important is that some of the ideas about racial differences in the body come from our understanding of racial differences with respect to disease, and some of those differences are still being used in medical practice, even though those differences emerged as long ago as the middle of the 19th century. Next slide. And as I said, differences in mortality and morbidity for diverse diseases were simply seen as manifestations of different racial capacities. Next slide. So race by 1900s is some kind of integrated physical, linguistic, and cultural totality. What happens over the 20th century is that integrated totality is broken apart. Different academic disciplines, sociology, history, psychology, anthropology for sure, began to tell us that race had different meanings within those different disciplines, as well as within biology and the new emerging genetics. Next slide. So this is just to talk about the ways in which observers like W.E.B. Du Bois in 1940, Nancy Steppen, who's written, which I still think is one of the best histories of the concept of race. Du Bois was one of the people who argued that there was no scientific definition of race that was possible. Of course, there are differences between peoples, but they fade in, and they're so hard to determine. We can only indicate the sort of main divisions. Steppen was very good at saying that, look, the whole project of classifying races became quite suspect. For an objective classification of mankind was needed. In 1950, they were used to divide mankind into 6 genetically defined races. 1963, the number was increased to 13. But what historians and sociologists began to observe is that many scientists found as many races as he wanted. So everybody was counting, and everybody was coming up with a different answer. Again, that's a point that some people that many of us take to mean, if you couldn't figure out how many races there were, there was no settled consensus in the scientific community, then I think it was really important that the critique that became predominant was that it's very hard to figure out what race is. Next slide. And biologists were certainly moving away from this old classification system because it didn't concur with new analyses in genetics and ecology and evolution. And biologists were moving from concepts of race as a type, a static entity, to race as a population that's constantly changing groups. Next slide. But surprisingly, the move toward thinking about race as a populational concept also had traces of the older view. Race was still thought of by many population geneticists as a biological phenomena, and they still use population as if it was a chronotype. African-American populations seemed no different than what people used to say about African-American as a race. So we weren't getting very far in that regard. Next slide. So I just want to, I think I'm getting close to time, but I just want to note a comment by the geneticist Dobzhansky, who Michael Yudell has written a lot about. He said, look, the inhabitants of different parts of the world are often visibly different. The differences are in part genetic. This is, in a nutshell, the essence of race as a biological phenomenon. Race differences are genetic differences between Mendelian populations, not between persons. But he also noted, next slide, yet races differ in the same traits in which persons also differ. So difficulties arise when a race or any group is given a name. One is likely to assume that the individuals composing the group are all alike, or at least very similar. And there you go with typological thinking again, which befuddles, as he noted, not only the man in the street, but some scientists as well. So people walked away from these typological thinking in biology, and the ascendance began of thinking about race as a social construct, and to think about populations in a more serious and careful way. Next slide. But this shift to population made the use of race somewhat redundant. But today, we still have people questioning, are populations as defined by many geneticists the same as groups called races in the United States? Next slide. Because of this history, sociologists, historians, anthropologists see race as a product of historical and social processes, not as a natural category that exists in nature. Next slide. And I love this slide by Du Bois because he actually points to what I'm trying to say in that last slide. He made this point in 1945 about the problem of race in the United States. And when he talked about the fact that in the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the US, passengers arriving on an aircraft are to be labeled according to race and are determined by the stock from which aliens spring and the language they speak, and to some degree, nationality. But Negroes apparently can belong to no race, no nation. Cuban, for instance, refers to Cuban people, but not to Cubans who are Negroes. West Indians refers to people of the West Indies, except Cubans or Negroes. Spanish American refers to peoples of Central and South America and of Spanish descent, but Negro refers to the Black African, whether from Cuba, the West Indies, North or South America, Europe or Africa. And moreover, any alien with a mixture of blood of the African should be classified under this Negro heading. That is about as confusing and complicated as you can get. Next slide. So the point of this really romp through history is that genetic, anthropological, medical, and epidemiological definitions and uses of race are not analytically congruent in theory or practice. And the answer to the question, what is race, continues to vary across fields. And the questions, what are the causes and nature of racial differences in disease? To what extent are the current designations used by Office of Management and Budget adequate or appropriate to be used in biological studies? Is race a valid or useful biological variable at the genetic level? And this can only be answered by if we think about the disciplinary differences and historical practices with respect to the use of race. Next slide. So there's no obvious way to dismantle this uneasy legacy because all of the efforts at measuring differences in human groups and the potential consequences of this work are mounted in using the same categories that have changed over time, and new groups of scientists in particular sometimes unknowingly inherit use of terms that came from a distant past of which they have no knowledge or understanding of the history of the use of the categories that they invoke. Thank you.
There I go. I was talking on mute. So thank you so much, Dr. Hammonds. That is a fantastic opening. I can tell people are already feeling, super curious. They want the slides. They're looking for the references. They want to know if the video is going to be posted. We have one great question, but you did a fantastic job of actually staying on time. So I want to go ahead and move into Dr. Hayes Bautista so he can give his presentation. Please continue to ask questions in the chat, because I think if everyone else does their due diligence to stay on time, we're going to have a full, probably 20 minutes to do our Q&As at the end. So Dr. Hayes Bautista, no pressure, no pressure. It's your turn. Unmute yourself.
Okay, now let me share my screen. There we go. Share that, and then bring it up. Okay, so I want to talk about Latinos in a certain way. And given that our metaphor is the racial box, basically, as I look, and as my family's looked at those race boxes we've been asked to respond to, it violates my family biography. So let's just start. Actually, the way we use race today in reporting out data, and we see it here is birth data. You can see it in COVID data. We have these neat little categories. So here we have the births that were in California, 2014. And you notice here are the Latino births up on top. Here are the white births, the Asian births, African American, Pacific Islander, etc. When the births are presented in this way, it reinforces this 230-year-old notion of biologically distinct groupings of people. So that as your average person looks at these things, it appears that to begin with, these categories are natural. I mean, babies are just born white, they're just born black, they're just born Latino. That's just natural. That they're mutually exclusive, that Latinos are not white, whites are not Asian, Asian are not African American. That they are internally consistent, all Latinos are alike, all whites are alike, all Asians are alike, all African Americans are alike. And that these are permanent, innate, individual characteristics. Basically, you're born with a race, you will die with that race. So it seems to reinforce that when we present the data in this fashion. Well, I was originally trained as an engineer, so I have a great interest in how do we measure something really simple. As we use race all the time in healthcare. In fact, when you're admitted to a hospital, about the third thing we know about you is your race before we even know why you came to the hospital. It's that important. So let's just take a look at how do we get ourselves into this mess. So most of you should have done the 2020 census by now. And you notice, I think it was the second question was, is this person Hispanic or not? And probably most of you on this said, no, I am not. And then you skip your pattern over to the next question. Okay, you're not Hispanic. So what race are you? And you were given these choices. You can be white, you can be black, you can be American Indian or Alaska Native. You can be Asian, Chinese, Filipino, Asian Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Samoan, Chamorro, etc., or other Asian. Or you can be some other race. Well, the people that say, I am not Hispanic, after 230 years, have pretty much learned the drill. They know which of those single boxes they're supposed to check, although now you can check more than one. But as we look at how non-Hispanics responded to the question on race in the 2010 census, basically, white people said they were white, black people said they were black, Indians said they were Indians, Asians said they were Asians, Pacific Islanders, etc. And in fact, only 2.3% said, well, actually, I'm two of these. And 0.2% said, I don't see my race or whatever that is. I don't fit these, so I guess I must be some other race. So that's typical of non-Hispanics. However, if you say, yes, Hispanic, then you have to specify whether you're Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, whatever else. And then Hispanics are asked, oh, by the way, and what race are you? And a lot of Latinos look at that. And when I show this to audiences that are Latino, at this point, they start to laugh and guffaw. And I ask them why they're laughing. They say, I don't see myself there. I'm not one of those. What do you mean you're not one of those? I'm not. And in fact, as we look at the response pattern to how Hispanics, those who said yes, Hispanic, how they respond to the question on race, slightly over half said they were white. About 2.5% said they were black, about 0.5% Asian, 1.5% American Indian, and 43% said, I don't see myself there. I must be some other race. Or a very small percentage, I'm two or more races. And even those Latinos who say I'm white don't always necessarily mean it the way that the Aryan Brotherhood means it. It could mean, well, I'm a US citizen. It could mean I'm middle class. I was born here. I'm American, so I must be white. So they're not meaning it always in that same sense that it's used by the white nationalist movements today. But Latinos seem to be really, really confused. In fact, I remember I was on an advisory committee to the 1980 census where for the first time they asked that Hispanic question. And I went around and around with them because they kept trying to fit it into this race system that the US has. And when the first returns, the SF1 came out that they used for congressional redistricting, they brought the advisory committee back to the census. And I remember one official of the Census Bureau came out, and he was just really upset. And he had a big sheaf of papers in his hands, and he slammed them down on the podium. And he said, do you realize in the 1980 census, half of Hispanics failed to answer correctly the question on race? Well, I reared back, because I've been having this conversation already for a couple of years. It's not that Hispanics failed to answer the question correctly on race. You're not asking the right questions. Thus, they're not responding the way you want them to. And it's been a knockdown, drag-out fight ever since. But ever since 1980, when Latinos are asked what race, about half will say, I must be something else. Why are Latinos so confused when asked what race they are? Well, that's why we need to look at the intersection of Latinos and the US racial binary narrative. So we have to understand that on October 11th, 1492, not one single Indian lived in the Western Hemisphere, not one. Oh, you had about 200 million people. They weren't Indians. They were Purepecha, Chumash, Tlaloc, Mapuche. They were not Indians. But the next day, that all changed. Christopher Columbus is trying to sail to India. He sees land. Oh, I've discovered India. He sees people. So you must be Indians. And we have been having confusion ever since. And even after 500 years, not all indigenous have learned that they're Indians yet. Okay, we start with that. So there's obviously the indigenous substructure. Along with Columbus and along with Cortez came Africans, some as conquistadores, others as slaves. They were present in Latin America from day one in 1492 and are also part of the population. And not just Mexico, there's a large Afro-Peruvian population. Even in Argentina, that likes to think itself as a little piece of Europe and Latin America, un pedazo de Europa en América Latina, as they say. In the 1825 census, a fourth of the population of Buenos Aires was African, and they didn't go anywhere. So now even Argentina began to understand, yes, they too have African roots. Asian roots. In 1565, the first Fraser fleet sailed from Acapulco to Manila, and then did a round trip back, hit North California, and then back to Acapulco. And for the next 250 years, people arrived from all over every part of Asia, from China, India, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, et cetera, also arriving and settling in. And then the Iberians that came over sometimes were a little bit different, because in 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel kicked all the Jewish folks out of Spain, and many of them came to the Americas. And they were so pleased with the results, about 20 years later, they kicked all the Muslims out of Spain, and many of them came to the Americas. And here, all these folks around the world met, married, formed families, had kids. Their offspring could be called various things: mestizo, if they were the mixture of Spanish and Indian; mulatto, if they were a mixture of African and Spanish. I like to call them, when people ask me, well, what is your race? I say, well, we are Indo, Afro, Oriental, Ibero-Americanos. The Spanish crown even tried to put some order to this. At one point, they had up to 16 different categories, depending on the percentages of Indo or African or Asian or European you might be. Now, interestingly, bringing this up, as we look at the 1,000 Genomes Project, as they've looked at Latin American populations, including Mexican American in Los Angeles, Puerto Rico, Mexico, you name it, as they look at ancestry, geographic, about 95% of Latinos have ancestry from West Africa. And about 98% have indigenous, and about 99% have European. So there's really a huge amount of admixture in Latino, which has always confused the United States. So we look at these births, and we try to put these babies into these categories. And a question I like to ask a lot of clinicians is, okay, so suppose you were attending when Obama was born, under what racial category would you put Obama's birth weight? And almost everybody, oh, he's black. And I say, well, actually, no. According to the census algorithm, you bridge, if you look at the top, you bridge the race of the mother to the baby. Actually, Obama was white. You would put his birth weight under the white category and his infant mortality under the white category. But he's black. Oh, let's look here. Let's measure. This is what we're supposed to do. In fact, this is what we do. So I just wanted to share what this means in a lived experience. Now, I was born here in LA, And this is a picture of my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and my mom. And this is something interesting. This picture was taken around about 1930, either in LA or in Arizona. Here is my grandfather and my grandmother on my mother's side. They were Tlailotlacan Indians. In fact, they came from a town called Atlautla that was founded in the year 1238, 800 years ago. It's still around, by the way, still there. So this was actually the glyph. This is the name of their town in the Nahuatl manuscripts. Nonetheless, they were up here in the United States. And I've been back to the family town. It's still there. My grandfather and my grandmother, however, spoke Aztec as their primary language, then learned Spanish, then learned English. Then my grandpa went on to learn Latin and Greek and a couple of others. Now, what was interesting, there were 5 sisters in the family, and each one married somebody from a different race ethnic group. So my Aunt Emma married a Mexican. He was from Guanajuato, Uncle Phil, and he was a dancer, folklorista. And in fact, I remember him always teaching us the jarabe tapatio. My mother married a gringo, an old Anglo family, actually had served as officers in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and then have moved out west during the time of the gold rush and has been out in the West ever since. And many of that family, even though they're Anglo, many of them speak Spanish. My dad spoke Spanish. He had a charro outfit. He played accordion in a conjunto in Texas. That's what brought him and my mom together, music. My Aunt Sarita married a Kanaka from Hawaii, a Hawaiian native. This is not him. This is actually a photo of Duke Kahanamoku. But my Uncle Danny Hanamaikai came with Duke Kahanamoku. They brought surfing to Southern California. My Aunt Virginia married her job. She was a nurse all her life. In fact, she worked at the very hospital on whose board I sit right now, White Memorial Medical Center in Boyle Heights in East LA. And then my Auntie Evelynn married a Chinese gentleman, although he was 3rd generation Hawaiian, been in Hawaii for about a century, but nonetheless, he was Chinese, and they met here. So this is all my family. And then we were asked, okay, so what race are you? And we look at that and we laugh. You got to be crazy. What the heck are you talking about? Nonetheless, we bridged the race of the mother to the baby. So it looks like this is the way the babies come in California. So we asked the question, well, what about the fathers? What if we bridged the race of the fathers to the babies? So we actually recreated these families using census data and looked at the race of the father as well as of the mother. And when we did that, it turned out that from 2011 to 2015, nearly 53% of all the babies born in California were racially ambiguous. That is, their parents were of different single race ethnic groups. Only 47% were they congruent, where the mother and the father are the same single race group. So if over half is racially ambiguous, under what category do we record their birth weight? When they come down positive for their test, under what category do we put the COVID case? When they die of COVID, under what category do we put the death? We had a conference last fall, and one of the panels actually were hospital administrators who looked at the race ethnic question asked on hospital admission forms and other forms, registry forms. And while it seems so scientific, actually it's ludicrous. It's not even self-assessed. Sometimes the algorithm for OSHPD, Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development, is to know somebody's race. Okay, ask them if you can, but if they're unconscious, ask somebody who knows them. Or if not, well, you look at their surname, you listen to the language, you find their birthplace, then you kind of do it from there. This is like horribly subjective. And yet we treat it as if it were a scientific phenomena that then would have predictive power in terms of health outcomes. So these racial categories clearly are social constructs as used in medicine. They are not at all scientific. Nonetheless, there are health disparities, and we're seeing them right in front of our eyes, using even the state of California definitions, which puts everybody into a single race group. As we look at age-specific death rates, for age 65 to 79, Latino, Black, and Native Hawaiian have about 5 times the death rate of white, and Asian and American Indian about 50% higher. So clearly there's something going on. but we're saying it's probably not genetic. It probably has to do with the racial structuring of society. The fact that we assume race, and because we have racially structured society, different people that are assumed to be of different races have differential access to social benefits and protections. And as in states like California, Texas, Florida, New York, where everybody's getting together and having racially ambiguous children, we can't use these single race categories much further into the future, as millennials increasingly refuse to answer the race question. So what do we use? What are the measures, the markers that we use to indicate health inequities as we move into our racially ambiguous future? And I learn a lot every time I raise this question, just thinking, you know, how would my Aunt Jenny do this? How would my Uncle Danny do this? I have my cousins. We talk about this incessantly. We think it's a real hoot. Hey, but we're all here. So this is our goal. We need to figure out, how do we identify and deal with health inequities with a racially ambiguous population? Thank you very much.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, David. I am answering chats. There's a lot of great commentary and conversations going on. Thank you all for being super thoughtful. I want to dive right into Dr. Alice Popejoy's presentation. Alice, are you there with us?
Yep, I'm here.
All righty, the screen is yours.
Okay, can you see my slide?
You're good to go.
Awesome, thank you so much, Michelle, for having me, and for Michael and David and Evelynn for working with us on getting this together. I feel really privileged to be part of this conversation, and I think it's important always to start by, when I talk about the topic of race and genetics, to just, you know, acknowledge that the irony of a very privileged, educationally, economically, racially white woman talking about race and genetics is, you know, could be kind of triggering for some people. And for me personally, it's been a very long journey of integrating and sort of learning about anti-racism work and how we can use our privilege both in science and in society to do better as scientists and as society. So just want to acknowledge that to get started, and make the case to you today that we shouldn't be focusing on race in science and medicine in the way that we do currently. This is a theme, obviously, of the entire panel, but I feel very strongly about this, both personally and professionally. And as a scientist, I think it's our obligation to make sure that we look at things that are unscientific and make sure that we do them appropriately. So I do this work as a postdoc at Stanford University in the medical school. I work with the medical school curriculum director on these issues for medical education. I work in this space for biomedical data science. And also I run an ancestry and diversity working group for the clinical genome resource. And that's also where my funding comes from, is NHGRI. But these, most of these opinions are mine based on science, but I don't represent NHGRI. That's just on there because they fund my work. So I want to start by saying that, you know, there are no universal definitions of race, ethnicity, and ancestry, but these are words I'm going to use in my presentation, and so I want to just give you a sense of the definitions that I mean when I say these words, and they're based on entire fields, scholars in social science, critical race theory, etc., that I sort of have integrated into my own understanding, and it's evolving, and I'm still learning as well. So, but when I talk about race, I am really talking about the social construct that is used to classify people into hierarchical tiers of status and power, and it's really an ideology based on inequality, and that without power dynamics and power structures, there's really not much to race. As far as ethnicity goes, it's often used interchangeably with race, but I talk about this more as, and I think about it as a cultural construct linked to community, religion, and language, versus ancestry was something that's gaining a lot of attention nowadays. People are talking about genetic ancestry. They're often using it in sort of in flux and with a lot of definitional slippage between race, ethnicity, and ancestry, maybe saying ancestry, but thinking race or meaning race or ethnicity. And I put this Venn diagram together to sort of demonstrate the fluidity of these concepts. And, you know, one, I think that it sort of exemplifies how there's lots of slippage between these terms and sort of causes confusion in our thinking about them is Asian, right? Asian geographically, that's half the world's population or more. So it's not particularly meaningful, but it has all these connotations. We might racialize someone by saying they look Asian, or we might talk about Asian food. We're sort of thinking something ethnic. And ancestry, right, is sort of that, okay, they have ancestors who came from Asia, which again is maybe somewhere in India or China or somewhere else in, the half the world's population. So I think it's important to just situate that. And as Michelle mentioned, my PhD is in public health genetics. So I think about public health genetics as the integration of genetics research and public health, and so how genetics impacts people and populations. And there are a lot of terms that I'll use today. We're talking about basically public health, health disparities. We're also talking about genetics and genomics. Some people may not be as familiar with these. So when we talk about genetics, we just mean that in every cell of our body, we have an entire copy of our whole genome, which is all of the genes that are encoding proteins that are making our body do what it's doing. But this is an instruction manual, and by itself, an instruction manual doesn't do anything. It needs to be read, it needs to be interacted with, things need to be built from it. And so I think when people talk about genetics, they're just thinking about this static instruction manual, when in fact there's always interactions with the environment and things going on to sort of impact our biology that are interacting with our genetics. So as a public health geneticist, this idea was really interesting to me of precision public health, that we can be more precise with what we're doing in healthcare and medicine by looking at people's genes. So this is a quote about precision public health, that it's the application and combination of new and existing technologies, like genetics, for example, which more precisely describe and analyze individuals and their environment over the life course in order to tailor preventive interventions for at-risk groups and improve the overall health of a population. So I want to focus on that precision piece precisely. Actually, when I started my PhD, I was working on the evolution of light receptor genes, and still did. I spent most of my PhD dissertation working on that. But in almost every guest lecture we had in classes over the course of the first few years of my PhD, there was always a slide that showed this pie chart here on the left, that 96% of genome-wide association studies or research that's done to sort of link genetic variation to traits has actually been done on people of European ancestry. And so there's like a little asterisk at the end or the beginning of their talk saying, well, whatever genetic analysis I did may or may not be relevant for other populations, because we pretty much just did it in white people, and that's true for all of genetics research, for the most part, conducted in the United States. And over the years, I was getting really frustrated that I was seeing the same pie chart over and over again. And I was thinking like, okay, well, what are we doing about this? I'm a student, but I'm frustrated because I feel like no one's addressing the elephant in the room, which is that what we're doing isn't really precise if we're only able to be precise about this small percentage of the population. So I actually dedicated a chapter of my dissertation to looking at this great resource, the GWAS catalog. It's an online catalog of all these associations that have been found, and did a sort of reanalysis to see how much we'd done. You can see in 2009, when the initial study was done, there were only 373 studies, and now there are over 2,500 with 35 million samples. So this was not particularly easy to do, but with a little computer programming, I was able to kind of tease it apart, and found that there's indeed a little bit more diversity now. And this was the pie chart that was published to sort of update this. And now people are talking about this figure. But actually, the majority of this growth in diversity has been in Asian countries by Asian researchers at Asian institutions. So when you exclude those, not because they're not important, they are, but I don't think that European and United States-based researchers can take credit for the explosion of genomics research being conducted in Asian countries, that in fact, we still have to take responsibility for the fact that where the majority of this research is happening, which is the US and Europe, that we're still primarily focusing on white people of European descent, which is a problem. There are some genetic some large-scale genomic diversity initiatives in the United States, some of which, I think are doing really well. Maybe others have other issues. So let's just pretend for this precision piece of precision public health that we actually do have diversity in our genetic samples moving forward. Just pretend that that's the case. We still have another problem, and that's this last part of the definition of precision public health, which is mentioning at-risk groups and the health of a population. But what is really even a population? This is actually kind of problematic. The whole paradigm of precision medicine, that we're being more precise with what we're doing, is that we're moving from this era where everybody got the same drug. We knew some people would have adverse events, and, you know, it's just kind of, we deal with it, to now where we can be more specific by grouping people based on different categories, demographics, what's their risk profile, what's their history, etc. But how we group those people is really ambiguous, to say the least. So there are many different ways we could define a population. We talk about the population of humans, everybody on the planet, right? We could talk about geopolitical populations, so we're talking countries or states, regional populations, the population of a city or an area. You could talk about an ethnic population, perhaps, or a population of people of a certain religion. And again, I mentioned this concept of ancestry that's been emerging in the last probably 20 years or so, where you talk about sort of based on where you have ancestors from, that you're a population from a particular ancestral area, which is a little bit silly because our whole genome is actually made up of different pieces of chromosomes that are inherited from different ancestors, probably from all over the place. So the idea that we have an ancestry or we belong in one ancestral population is still a little bit of racialized thinking, right, where we want to put people into a box. We talk about socioeconomic populations, and there are many different ways to define populations. So often in genetics and in medicine, we talk about populations as if it's like a real thing, but without really examining what that actually means. And it might make sense to look at certain populations, even though most, all humans, obviously we're the same species, so our genomes are 99.9% identical. There's very, very, very few differences actually in between any one of our genomes, but there are some adaptations that have occurred. So if somebody's ancestors were a particular location, like let's say in Greenland, the Inuit population has this variant in a fatty acid enzyme that perhaps allowed them to have a high animal fat diet. Also, one that people know about a lot is lactose tolerance. There's this persistent ability to process lactose, and people sort of think about that as a white trait. Actually, you have white supremacists chugging milk on YouTube, right, with this milk pride, but actually that ability to process lactose has also evolved in many other places, including in Africa. So this is not racial based. And similarly, people think about sickle cell anemia as a Black disease, but in fact, it's just an actual evolutionary adaptation to the presence of malaria in a region. So this is not just, it's not in the whole continent of Africa, right? Regions of Africa that have malaria, but also regions of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Southern Europe. So we're having this racialized thinking in science when that's not really what we're seeing and what we're looking at. However, when I looked at these descriptions in the GWAS catalog of all of these populations that have been studied, they're all over the place. Some of them are racial. We have Black controls, Black cases, European, sort of geopolitical, but what does that really mean? You have, Ashkenazi Jewish, so maybe this is an ethnicity. You have Hispanic, which, David talked about is sort of a ethno-linguistic category. So we're all over the map in terms of how populations are being described and analyzed in genetics research. And so what we are actually operating on most of the time in science, to many people's surprise, is actually the OMB census categories that David mentioned. So we have these sort of finite boxes and we pretend that they're biologically meaningful. And part of the reason for that is that as researchers, we're required to report who's included in our research. So this is to make sure that it's inclusive, that people are represented in our research. But what happens is researchers will then take those categories they have to report to the funders and treat them as if they're supposed to be using them to analyze their data and in fact do so. So these categories get ported over into our research protocols. They're embedded in the electronic medical records and in all sorts of clinical forms, and everything that you are checking a box when you're entering a clinic, for example, involves these. So this is a screenshot of some different clinical lab requisition forms that have the different categories that are often used in different laboratories. So they're different across all different laboratories, and the categories, again, vary across sort of Hispanic, ethno-linguistic, racial, Caucasian, what does that really mean, etc. So this is what the sort of aggregate, and if you get the slides later, you can look through this, but I don't want to spend too much time. But just to say that of 10 different clinical labs we looked at that are doing a lot of genetic analysis, 9 out of 10 had Hispanic, most of them had Black or African American in some cases, and there was so much diversity in the way that Europeans were described, but very little diversity in how other groups that are actually much more diverse genetically speaking, such as Asian, 7 out of the 10 forms had just Asian, which again is roughly half the world's population, so not particularly meaningful. And why are we doing this? Since the 1970s, we've had genetic analysis. So this is a quote from Dick Lewontin in a study he did where he looked at these sort of quote unquote races among humans and looked at biomarkers and found that actually 85% of the genetic variation is within each of these groups, not between them. So since the 70s, it's been very well understood and established that racial classification is of virtually no genetic or taxonomic significance, and so there is no justification for continuing to use these categories. So why do we do it? And I think part of the reason is that it's a legacy of racial oppression in the United States in particular. And I saw a question in the chat earlier about other contexts. In some countries, I did 6 months of research in Norway, and it's actually illegal to ask somebody's race or ethnicity. So this is not the case in every part of the world. And I think there may be some reasons to still continue collecting race and ethnicity so we can track things like health disparity. But in the context of medicine, separating people on the basis of what they look like and how society treats them and where they live in the hierarchy of power in a particular cultural context is based on this idea of biological racism, that there is some fundamental biological differences between people on the basis of race, which is just scientifically untrue, and that, you know, in the Jim Crow era, this was actually codified into hospitals and clinical care because, you know, somebody looking at your intake form needed to know which tower of the hospital to send you to or which clinic to send you to. So I think that some of the reasons why we're still using these categories and have this racialized thinking that we're sort of reinventing as ancestry in some cases might be based on this notion that there is some fundamental difference when in fact that's just sort of inheritance of white supremacy. So in closing, just want you to go home letting everyone you know that somebody from Stanford told you there's no genetic basis for racial categories at all, the way we use them in the United States, and yet they're still widely used in science, medicine, and society without real scientific justification or otherwise. And that the consequences of perpetuating and reinventing racist narratives in science and precision medicine may be far greater than the benefits of categorizing people by race for the purpose of tracking disparities. So what do we do? Well, I don't know the answer. I don't pretend to know the answer. And hopefully in the discussion, maybe some of you have good ideas. And hopefully moving forward with this initiative, we can invite people to the conversation to give us ideas. But I really think we need to collect and use information that is more closely related to the outcome of interest. I'm not the first person to have said this. Social epidemiologists have been talking about this for a really long time. I'm relatively new to the conversation. But I think it's really important that we think about someone's place rather than their race. So what is their place in society? What is someone's place in the social hierarchy of power that exists in a cultural context? What is someone's place geographically? What's the air quality like? What's the access to water like, the access to food? There are a lot of public health principles that I think if we're infused in genetics research and precision medicine, that we could get a lot closer to what's actually making people sick or healthy based on their place in society. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
There we go. Sorry. I accidentally stopped recording, but I started recording again right away for those of you who are going to be anticipating being able to share and watch this again. We're going to move right into Dr. Michael Yudell. Thank you so much, Alice, for that. I know a lot of folks were waiting for somebody to draw that big, bright line between white supremacy and oppression and racial constructs. I think Michael's going to do a lot more of that. I'm going to guess in his presentation. So onward.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hope everybody's having a nice afternoon or late morning, wherever you are across the country. I'm going to jump in and try to weave some of the themes we've been talking about this morning together and try to explain a little bit from my perspective and the perspective of some of my colleagues and collaborators, sort of what's happening and percolating out in the policy universe right now in terms of thinking about racial categories, but also to provide additional context from my perspective in public health and as a historian and ethicist of public health. So what is race? So race is a lot of different things. Race is a source of pride, and this is a civil rights era Black is beautiful pin. Race is a source of self-understanding and community, and you can send your DNA away to 23andMe or Ancestry.com to learn more about your own ancestral makeup from these companies. And in terms of self-identity, two different companies told me I have very different, racial backgrounds or ancestral backgrounds. According to Ancestry.com, which is the figure on your right on the screen, I am largely European, Ashkenazi Jewish, and a little Italian, and some Irish. Whereas a test that was submitted at the same time to 23andMe showed slightly different results, largely European, Ashkenazi Jewish, but also West African. And to further complicate this, these results keep getting updated, and my identity as predicted by these two companies has changed quite a bit. I'm no longer Irish, and I am now North African, partly instead of West African. So again, relying on these tests and making sense of who we are is a whole time for a whole nother lecture. Race is also a source of resistance. This is civil rights icons Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, and more recently Colin Kaepernick, who helped spur on the recent Black Lives Matter movement and is an important civil rights icon himself these days. It's also a source of oppression and carnage. This is a lithograph of a slave ship, and we're not going to get into history of slavery here, but the forced movement of Africans from different parts of Africa to the Americas beginning centuries ago was part of our history in the US and other parts of the world. This is a 20th century example of the way race was used to oppress and harm people. This is a map showing the total number of eugenic sterilizations in the United States as of January 1st, 1935. That was 21,000. The recorded tally is closer to 60, 70,000. And then there were many unrecorded eugenic sterilizations as well that went on in this country during the 20th century. This is the gates of Auschwitz, where my ancestors, some of my ancestors met their awful fate as part of the Holocaust because of the racial, ethnic, and religious group that they belonged to. This is another more recent example, tiki torch-bearing white supremacists. And there was another thing that was supposed to pop up, but it didn't. Oh, no, it pops up on this one, I'm sorry. And then race is also a source of discrimination. These are Japanese internment camps in the United States from World War II. These are more recent internment camps of migrants from Central and South America. An example from the academic literature showing that over the last few decades, there's been no change in racial discrimination in hiring, and that this is a really eye-opening paper for some. This is an example of discrimination in the South. We talk a lot about the legacy of Jim Crow, but there was also Juan Crow, which was discrimination against Spanish-speaking individuals across the South before and during the Civil Rights Movement. And then this literally just popped up before this talk. This was a news item that showed up from the United Nations today, where they were doing a survey, talk about the relevance of this topic, doing a staff survey to try to determine what racial groups people belong to. And among the groups people were asked to self-identify with was the group yellow, which is an old racist term from many decades ago that you do not see very often, but apparently somebody at the UN made this, from our perspective, terrible mistake, but perhaps from their perspective, they had different intentions. We'll see how this plays out. So race is all these things: source of pride, discrimination, carnage, oppression, yet it is also a classificatory tool. It's a way to organize people and populations in scientific practice, both natural and social science research, and a way to understand and make sense of different populations and how they are faring in our society. So one way is to look at it as a scientific category. This is an evolutionary tree of human races published by Neil Risch, who was mentioned earlier, and separating humanity into 5 broad racial groups. There are obviously lots of ways to do this. But one thing that is sort of right now, at least, baked into scientific practice, this is the Public Health Inclusion Enrollment Form that is used in all grant submissions funded by federal agencies. And you have to, before you, as you're submitting your project, identify who will be your participants. And there are racial and ethnic categories integrated into this document. You can take a look at it for a moment. But this is really where the concept of race gets baked into scientific practice today. This is required by the Office of Management and Budget out of the US Congress. And it was created as a way to increase the participation in research of more diverse populations. Yet, as I and others have argued, it has become sort of a reductionist way to think about differences between peoples and populations. So this is, you know, an ongoing challenge. So with my colleagues, Dorothy Roberts, who is a legal scholar and sociologist, Rob DeSalle, who's a geneticist, and Sarah Tishkoff, who's an evolutionary biologist, we published a paper in 2016 arguing that race had no place in the field of human genetics, and in fact, using racial categories was harmful to both peoples and populations. We believe the use of biological concepts of race in human genetic research, so disputed and so mired in confusion, is problematic at best and harmful at worst. It is time for biologists to find a better way. So since then, we've been doing more work. I'll tell you about that in a second, but I want to just describe briefly the ways in which science and clinical medicine, and a little later we can talk about social science. I saw there were some questions about social scientists using self-identified race in different ways than natural scientists and clinicians, which is true, but there are still problems with that as well. So when do scientists use race? Biologists use it to classify groups and study the history of human populations. Geneticists use it to investigate disease-causing genes within and between populations. Anthropologists use race to study human populations and physical and cultural traits. Physicians can use a patient's race to make decisions about their risks for certain diseases and how they might metabolize drugs. And public health scientists use race to understand broader health trends within and between populations, usually within broader health determinants like social determinants of health and environmental determinants of health, but still using racial categories nonetheless. There are diverse opinions on the utility of the race concept in population studies. Some argue that genetic information can be seen at the racial level, others arguing that race is neither relevant nor an accurate way to understand or map genetic diversity, and still others arguing that race-based predictions in clinical settings, because of the heterogeneous nature of racial groups and the relationship between groups, are of questionable use. So still, as the previous panelists have pointed out, this is a concept that is utilized in many different contexts. What are some of the challenges? Well, there's a general lack of clarity and consistency in the use of racial terminology. There's a general failure of scientists to distinguish between self-identified racial categories and assigned or assumed racial categories. In other words, some studies will say, describe race, but that race is being generated by the individual who's in that study. And in other studies, the clinician or researcher will assign or assume racial categories. And there also remains the challenge of needing to justify the use of racial categories relative to the research questions asked and the methods used, which of course will get us to that social science issue later that I hope we can take up in the Q&A. What are some of the dangers? Well, this was a paper from about 6 years ago out of the University of Virginia Medical System, Racial Bias in Pain Assessment and Treatment Recommendations and False Beliefs about Biological Differences Between Blacks and Whites. And this is a paragraph from the end of the paper. The present work sheds light on heretofore unexplored source of racial bias in pain assessment and treatment recommendations within a relevant population. These were medical students and residents in a context where racial disparities are well documented, that is pain management. It demonstrates the belief that beliefs about biological differences between blacks and whites, beliefs dating back to slavery, are associated with the perception that black people feel less pain than do white people, and with inadequate treatment recommendations for black patients' pain. So you can see here these are real manifestations on people's health, not just sort of broad-based population ways in which discrimination manifests itself, but individual ways that discrimination and the idea of race harms people in real ways. And this is about pain. Here's another example. This was a book that came out about 6 years ago, Troublesome Inheritance by Nicholas Wade, who was a science writer at the New York Times. Charles Murray, you can see is quoted here. He wrote a book called The Bell Curve, which was a racist tract describing a racial hierarchy in IQ, but we're not going to get into that now. And he cited studies from evolutionary biologists and geneticists and anthropologists that were not meant to use in a way that reinforced racial hierarchy, but he did so and published this popular book. It became a New York Times bestseller, making claims about differences between racial groups, things like, it wasn't colonialism that did great harm to Africa. It was the fact that Africans are genetically inferior, and other ridiculously offensive notions like Jews, the group I belong to, had a natural penchant for banking and money, which of course relates to many millennia of anti-Semitism towards Jewish people. This forced many of the scientists whose work was cited in Wade's book to issue a statement in the New York Times saying essentially that Wade had misinterpreted and misunderstood them. But it really gets to the problem that we've all been discussing today, which is that using race in these contexts is always going to generate some type of harm and some type of inconsistency of use, and fail to adequately describe human populations in a way that can help us improve, in the context of my work as an example, the health and well-being of different populations, because race has very specific historical meanings and contemporary meanings that are rooted in hierarchy and difference that are not going to go away until we jettison the use of this concept especially in biological studies where that hierarchy is built in. So if race is such a controversial concept in biology and medicine, then why do scientists and clinicians keep using it? One is the historical context. I'm not going to spend much time on this because Evelynn did such a fantastic job providing some of the history. But needless to say, Samuel Morton, as an example, measured skulls in the mid-19th century to show that whites had the largest cranial capacity and therefore the highest IQ, and then there was a hierarchy of racial groups moving down through different races. These ideas were ridiculous and had no bearing in reality, yet they became inscribed in the way that we think about contemporary differences over the centuries. This was a eugenic exhibit from the Second Eugenic Congress at the American Museum of Natural History in 1921, in which black and white chromosomes are made to look different, and there was an argument as part of this that there were in fact significant differences in what genetics was between different populations. And you heard earlier Evelynn mention both Du Bois and Dobzhansky, who are the subject in large part of my book Race Unmasked. And Du Bois, as Evelynn pointed out, argued as early as the 1890s that racial categories were poor proxies for understanding any difference between populations of people, and that instead we should be looking at social and organic differences that later became known as social determinants of health. And Du Bois developed measurements and methods for understanding those differences more than 120 years ago. So that's a fantastic place to start if you want to understand the sociology of of race and difference. And then, of course, Dubzhansky, beginning in the late 1920s, did a lot of groundbreaking work to try to move us away from typology. But as Dr. Hammonds' quote showed earlier, even Dubzhansky, who wanted to move us away from the use of race in biology in a crude typological way, himself was stuck in this dualistic or paradoxical thinking, which defined his own career, which was the simultaneous belief in the utility of the biological race concept in studies of human genetic diversity, and the belief that the biological race concept is imprecise and of limited use. And that's sort of where we're stuck. And we argued in our paper in 2016, and I argued in my book in 2014, that this paradox is so baked into how we continue to define difference in natural and social sciences that we don't even realize that what we are doing is reinforcing this typology or this hierarchical belief that there's something fundamentally different between groups. And we do it in clinical medicine, in public health, in the natural sciences, and in the social sciences. So just quickly summing things up, where are we now? Well, almost 20 years ago in the Rose Garden, I'm sorry, I think it was in the East Room in the White House. This is President Bill Clinton and Francis Collins, who's now the head of the National Institutes of Health, who was then the head of the National Human Genome Research Institute, and Craig Venter, who sequenced the genome privately for Celera Genomics, had an announcement in June of 2000 that the human genome sequence was complete, and that that one of their major discoveries was that there was no such thing as human race. That idea did not really integrate itself into the rest of science. You can see here, this is a study from the late, I think it was 2008 or 2009, showing that the darker chart, racial realism, and the lighter chart, social construction of race, where social construction of race stays pretty static in leading scientific journals. Racial realists, meaning that there was something biological to race, is exploding in the wake of that genome announcement. And you can see that explosion following the genome announcement in 2000, although the last few years, there has been a dip. If you look at keywords in PubMed, which culls all scientific papers, keyword race genetics and medicine, there has been a drop. We'll see if that sustains itself, and that if we're moving towards other terms like population or ancestry. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, and skip this too, just to suggest some fixes for how to deal with this challenge. One of the suggestions that we and others have made is that IRBs and journals require authors to define what they mean by race or population when they use it as a variable in their research, that the requirement to rationalize the use of racial and other population categories would at the very least for scientists to clarify its use. And this is not just an issue of language, but of precision and utility, because as we've argued, race is a poor proxy for understanding a variety of components of a variety of health determinants, and that we want to do better in both individual health and population health. Alice was talking about some alternatives in encouraging the use of terms like population and ancestry, which are actually important because ancestry is a process-based concept versus race, which is more of a pattern-based concept, which has led scientists and laypersons again to draw conclusions around hierarchy. And our argument, finally, is that phasing out racial terminology in the biological sciences would send an important message to clinicians, scientists, and the public alike that historical racial categories infused with notions of superiority and inferiority, even if not a current intent, have no place in scientific study. Briefly addressing the social construct issue and the social sciences issue, using race as a political or social category to study racism and its biological effects, although fraught with challenges, does remain necessary, but we need to think very carefully about how we do this. We've seen a lot of studies trying to do just this, that in the end simply reinforce racist notions of difference. Next steps, taking up Dubzhansky's challenge at the end of his career, he argued that the problem that now faces the science of man, excuse the gendered language, is how to devise better methods for further observations that will give more meaningful results. And there are many of us who are doing just that. That's why we are gathered here today. We've been working with the National Academy of Sciences to try to launch a working group that would bring together natural, social scientists, and scholars from the humanities to figure out how to move the fields, both natural and scientific fields, forward to move away from race as a category in research. I think technologically we are able to do it in terms of having more precise views of people's complex ancestry, and certainly socially in this very dire social and political moment we are in, we should feel driven to put this issue in a new light, because we are doing such harm, as all of us have pointed out, in sticking with this topic. So there have been a number of meetings, 2006 meeting sponsored by NIH, a 2018 meeting sponsored by the academies, and we're hoping potentially in a new administration next year that this project will be funded. We have a piece coming out in a major journal next month that we have many signatories for, calling for this to finally move forward. And I will close with a news item from just last week. Senior U.S. lawmaker wants the national academies to scrutinize racism in science. So this is a moment when we are really seeing a lot of energy and thought being put into how do we take steps away from the way science currently operates to move us towards a new system that will benefit all peoples equally. So I will end there. Thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing people's questions. And again, a huge thanks for our fellow panelists, David, Alice, and Evelyn, and a doubly huge thank you to Michelle Burton, who inspired all of us to come together today and not do a typical scientific panel to our colleagues who talk about this stuff a lot, although there's still a lot of work to do on that front too, don't get me wrong, but to take this out into the community and think with the assistance of the Social Change Institute and the Community Health Councils in LA about how do we start having a public discussion about these issues, and recognizing that all of us, all of the academics on this call who are interested in this have been thinking a lot about these issues and pushing, but us pushing from the inside can only get us so far. So that's why I'm really inspired by this session today, and hopefully we'll do more like these for pushing from the outside to foment change. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to thank everybody who's hanging out. I think if folks can bear it, we did have a couple of questions. So for people who don't have anything else to jump onto, I'm going to go ahead and throw those out there. I think we've kind of covered some of them, but let's pull out a couple. So one of them was someone was struck by the reference to the U.S. context and understanding how other jurisdictions deal with this. And is this construct of race somewhat unique to the U.S., or how does this differ outside? And I know, Michael, on some of our prior calls, we did talk about how in other countries, they don't have these racial categorizations, right? I know, so I see David is jumping out of his seat as far as he can.
Yes.
David, go.
Okay, well, after our conference last November on racial ambiguity in these categories, I actually did a presentation for a group of physicians, and they got really, and they had their own data, by the way, and it's showing that the differences between white, black in terms of outcomes, and of course, a lot of it had to do with the interventions. And so one of them said, oh, gee, I'd like to go to France and do this. I said, you can't go to France and do this. Well, why not? They don't collect race. But it's around the world, it's natural. No, it's not. They're very much a social construct. In fact, in very few countries do we collect information about people's race. US is one of the very few left. Almost nobody else does it.
Great, thank you.
Agreed, but with that said, it doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist in those places. So France, as an example, has, especially with North African immigrants and people with North African ancestry in France, face tremendous discrimination and racism because of the color of their skin and their ancestry, even though they don't acknowledge it as such.
It's also true that in the UK, and certainly in the former, the countries that were part of the former empire, there are lots of conversations and complications about how racial categories are used. For a while, there was a sort of coalition of people from the various commonwealths that argued that Black could describe all of them, and from the Caribbean across the Indian subcontinent, and as well as parts of Asia. That sort of coalition is broken apart a little bit. But so yeah, there's no one way that people do it in various other countries and nations. But I would say the similarity, especially in countries that were former colonies of various European empires, there's absolutely systemic and institutional racism in the histories of those countries' treatment of various indigenous groups in those places.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to another question that's relevant to today and our issues around COVID. Because as we can see, this is a very complex issue. There's not going to ever be a magic bullet to solving for it. So another example of this is in regards to tracking the disparate impact of COVID-19 on different communities. How can this be done without tracking it by race, if race is a problematic categorization, right? So I think that's a great real-time example. How would you all respond to that?
Well, we need to understand that race, particularly in this country, is connected to powers of the state and the racially structured society. For 230 years, the idea was to keep less desirable races away from full benefits, et cetera. And in many of these minoritized, racialized groups contested their role where they were placed. They raised their voice, they used their agency, and have created, if you will, their own subaltern racial narratives, experiences, sort of the other side of the lived experience. In fact, one of the things I think we need to do before we get rid of all these categories is understand the lived experience for centuries. How has that also helped form and shape some communities? Then we can start to look more at the issue of how the racially structured society really has been the one that creates these differences we eventually see in the health outcomes.
Great. Thank you, David. And I think also the recognition that you've put out in your papers, how many essential workers, just as a small example, tend to be, you know, people who I would have been identified as people of color, which is another disproportionate fact. And why are they in those categories? Well, you know, due to the lack of access to, you know, quality education and economics and livable wage and all that other good stuff.
Let me just add, Michelle, one of the things we could have done, if we kept data on how many people in a given region live in multi-generational households, how many people live in households of a small square footage, would we have gotten some information about whether or not those people in those households could be socially distant? Would we have known something then about the density of population that we could use to also make public health appeals for people to protect themselves against the virus? We don't have to go to race to do it. We could have done it. That was one other piece of information we could have used.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely.
So add to that point, we are starting to see in the published literature a focus on biological race as it relates to COVID. And that is really troubling. And again, it's the easy fallback that scientists have because, you know, if I'm going to be generous to scientists and geneticists especially, they don't have training in social science research. They don't, you know, their focus is on the relationship between a gene and an outcome with maybe some, you know, complications. What we need to think about is more, you know, interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research where social scientists are working more closely with geneticists to be able to think more clearly about these issues. There's a new field that's emerged called biosocial research, you know, in which some of the same pitfalls exist that, you know, we've been discussing. But there are some folks in that area who've been trying to thoughtfully think about the impact of racism on populations. And how that relates to outcomes. So we'll see how that all plays out. And we live in interesting times. So, you know.
Great. So one last question for you guys before we let everyone go. Alice, was that you?
It was. I was going to add something, but if you want to ask another question.
No, please, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I just wanted to add that I think based on Evelynn's comment that, you know, looking at someone's place is really important, obviously, but I also think the problem is in identifying the proper outcome. So often we're like, COVID. What do you mean COVID? Do you mean exposure? So somebody's employment might matter, or, you know, as to whether they're exposed, or as you know, Dr. Hammonds mentioned, how the type of household that somebody lives in, with how many people, in what, you know, neighborhood, and what's the population density, but also what is their employment? Are they an essential worker? Are they to have higher exposure rates systematically as a result of racialized, basically, hierarchies and who has access to what positions and education, et cetera. So that's sort of step one, is exposure. And then once exposed, then do you actually get sick, right? So that's another element that's more biological, that has to do maybe with some comorbidities. If you have pre-existing conditions that might make you more susceptible to getting really sick once you've been exposed. So there are other factors that you could look at there. And then once you've been hospitalized and you're in the ICU, what are your outcomes then? The decisions that are being made about your care, or your pre-existing health conditions that lead to, you know, mortality or worse health outcomes as a result of getting really sick from COVID. So I think when we talk about COVID just like as one category, as an outcome, or even just death by COVID, and we ignore all the other steps, we don't take the time to tease apart what are the different elements of public health and maybe genetics that are impacted. So maybe if you just look at people who are really, really sick in the ICU, and there may be some genetic differences that make people more susceptible to die from being really sick with COVID, but it's probably not going to be based on anything racial, versus there may be more race-based differences in exposure rates due to systemic racism and inequality. So I just wanted to clarify that. And I think it's important for COVID to think about it in terms of like stages, and what do you mean when you say COVID, and really being clear about that, because otherwise we're subject to the slippage again between the different categories.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. And I just know, you know, for one, I've told my whole family as a Black woman, if I get sick, don't take me to a hospital. Don't, because they're going to put me in a laundry closet somewhere. That's my, you know, my very candid, you know, street level response to how I feel COVID threatens me in a very real way. I have one more question. I'm sort of going to combine some of folks' questions here in this last sense. So for example, we've got a Turkish immigrant who's been listening in, and she says people get really upset if she doesn't identify with Black or white American as an identity, and that they want her to check a box, right? And then in that sense, you know, as practitioners in our own fields, as scholars, as activists, as, you know, corporate members of the business world, all the variations, as foundation people, all the different folks represented, you know, who are listening in today, how do we, you know, measure the impacts of these societal constructs of race without perpetuating the construct, right? So how do we do that? You know, what is your recommendations, you know, panelists, to how do we continue to work on this? Because clearly, you know, my way of doing this was by, you know, trying to twist arms and getting you all to have this panel discussion with us, who many of us would be considered neophytes in your field, right? So by opening that door and allowing us to be a part of your conversations and dialogue and bringing this into the mainstream is one way I'm hoping to combat the construct without perpetuating it. What are other examples of that you guys can give? David?
Well, I would urge, before we throw everything out, let's make sure we understand the lived experience of those who have been raised, sometimes for generations, on the other side of this racial structuring, because that has affected their lives, for better or for worse, but as part of what they have to deal with. I don't think that we as researchers should just unilaterally say, okay, now we're going to throw these terms out, we're going to use these. Let's make this organic and let everybody participate in that.
Thank you. Next. Yep. Michael?
I'll just jump in to say, you know, our argument first and foremost is to stop using race as a biological variable, which I am comfortable throwing out today. The challenge becomes race as a social variable. I see there's a question from Kim Wired, who's asking about, you know, how do you measure changes or progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the workplace? And we can go on and on about where race is important. That, as David points out, is about the lived experience of race. how do you, I think what we have to do a lot of thinking about, and I'm not prepared to give a hard answer to this, but it's that slippage that, Michelle, you mentioned between biological race concepts and social race concepts that we need to think about. I think the most interesting suggestion out there is to not talk about race, racial categories per se, but to talk about racism as the measured variable. And that, I think, allows us to both continue to, you know, understand the lived experience, but to move away from this notion of biological difference.
Thank you. Dr. Hammonds, Dr. Popejoy, any last words on that before we close?
Well, you know, I think one of the things in my long time looking at the sort of history of use of race concepts in science and medicine, you know, in a way, using race, whether it's, and some people now say, well, we had a group of people we were studying and this is how they identified themselves. So self-report is what we use. We didn't tell them what their race was, they told us what it was. But you know what? It's lazy. It's lazy. It doesn't require the analysts, the scientists to really interrogate what is it you're trying to understand. Are you trying to understand a particular kind of biological process? Are you trying to understand human genetic variation at a particular level? And then be able to say clearly, unequivocally, why a racial category helps you understand that problem. If we don't push people to explain and justify, hold accountable, people are going to continue to be lazy because it's acceptable. You don't have to interrogate white ever. It's a default norm position. And then you divide everybody else up according to their differences from your white norm. Why do we let that pass? Why do we say if you do that in an article that's under peer review, it gets published? It shouldn't get published anymore. We have to stop letting people be sloppy, lazy, and use really deeply unexamined categories that have really serious individual consequences for people's lives.
Thank you, Dr. Hammonds. Alice?
Well, I completely agree with that, everything that's been said. And I think that there might be opportunities moving forward and some of the things that I'm exploring to do better. I think it actually is important to ask people who they are, but not who they are racially, which is, you know, David has talked about this idea that how people identify racially and ethnically is probably pre-baked based on those boxes they've had to check their whole lives anyway. But that maybe we could ask people about their place, that maybe they could speak in their own language, let's say into, you know, a recorder or into a computer, and that we could have some sort of fancy algorithms to process that, have them describe their lives or where they live or their situation or how they feel like they've been treated as, you know, on the basis of race. So some way to sort of capture somebody's lived experience in ways that might be able to give us better information about their risk for disease. So I don't know what the answer is methodologically, and it probably, as some folks mentioned in the chat, may not actually come from science, that there may be some social pressure to do things differently, and that we may not figure out the solutions as scientists because we're, you know, so sort of narrow focused. But I do think that, you know, there are possibilities to do it better. We just have to accept that this is a scientific problem. I think that's the main issue that I come up against, is that folks consider diversity in genetics research to be sort of ethical, you know, an ethical issue or a PC issue. You don't want to talk about race because you're politically correct or you're a special liberal snowflake or something like that. And really, I think we need to acknowledge as a scientific field and as medicine that this is not just morally and ethically wrong, but first and foremost, it's an inaccurate way to do things and it's harming people. And so I think that's the main message that I want us to sort of, you know, take back to science, and then that for people to know that we in science need help because we haven't really fully accepted the logical and scientific fallacies of what's being done currently. So we need the social pressure for people to say this isn't okay.
Great, awesome. So on that, I want you all to stay tuned. I am not letting any of these fabulous speakers nor any of our fabulous attendees off the hook. Our goal is to have a follow-up gathering in which we invite all of you to have critical conversations around how we move forward with strategies to change this problem. So to, Mark's comment earlier he made in the chat about, how do we, do this for folks of us who are on the ground? Assessing institutional progress and addressing racism, right? So I think we've had some great, answers in regards to, what researchers and scholars can do to have some checks and balances with one another. But what can those of us do on the ground? That's still a question. And I think there's still a lot more questions. And I'm gonna look forward to working with all of you and reaching out and hopefully engaging you in a larger discussion where we can break into groups and have some really rich dialogue around these issues and how we can work together in our own little worlds to make this better and create some best practices. So again, thank you all so much. Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists, Dr. Hammonds, Dr. Popejoy, Dr. Yudell, Dr. Hayes Bautista. Thank you guys so much for being with us today and sharing your wisdom. We appreciate it and look forward to hopefully engaging you guys again in the future. And thank you everybody for spending time with us today.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Putting
you.
these together.
Thank you so much, Michelle.